Well, dear Christian, you are the inviting power, so to speak. So thank you to welcome us as the director of Toulouse Economics School and author of the 4th and 5th GIEC report. And also, you have written this marvelous book about the climate following after the end of the month. And then it's a really enlightening book, as my colleague on this paper said from Le Point. You say a number of truths that are difficult to hear, like the concept of energy transition, which is a utopia, because this goes much beyond the climate, the health, the education and well-being. You invoked with our friend Ben how we can measure the political effects of these public policies and the actions of the companies. And you are going to launch with your colleague Ben Tomström, whom is by my side, MIT laureate of the Nobel Prize in 2016 for the work on regulation and work which has been which has shown a long friendship with Jean Tirole and Toulouse School of Economics, and Ben is sitting at the scientific committee. So the topic is going to animate our should we make sacrifices? Can we transform these challenges into opportunities? Now, this is a session which is going to be in English. However, be not afraid, ask questions even in French, because we have the possibility of looking at the QR code, and Ben and Christian have decided to limit their intervention to about 15 minutes so that you have question and answers for 15 minutes as well. Christian, you have the floor. But
Ça marche, oui.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to this prestigious conference. I've never spoken in the same time as President Macron, so that's already something new. And as you mentioned, I'm a longtime friend of the Toulouse School of Economics, and worked with Jean extensively. And it dates back to the, I would say, the 80s. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Let me say a few words. This is only 15 minutes, and I'm going to make a few remarks from a different angle, perhaps from what usually is spoken about. But we all understand the problem. The basic problem is that we are starting to realize that we are destroying an asset or resource or resources that have a lot of value, and we have done it without pricing them at all for hundreds of years, and it has really accelerated in the last, say, 50 years or so, and we have woken up very, very recently to the fact that hopefully not too late, but very recent to the fact that we are destroying the essential part of our input and our quality of life. So the question is what to do about it, and I want to start with an observation that I hope people don't think I've gone nuts, but it's worthwhile understanding that one of the drivers of this problem is that we have very sharp measures of market activity and what we are doing in the market, and we are getting more and more efficient with regard to measuring and improving markets. We have insurance contracts. We have also, you look at the financial markets, they are extraordinarily highly developed. We have pretty good measures on GDP, gross national product, and other such. So we think of the economy mainly as being that part, or we have thought about the economy mainly as that part. But there is the other part, which is the use of the resources that we don't have very good measures of. And it used to be that they were essentially what we call the marginal cost, the incremental cost of spending another unit of water or breathing or other unit of air or something, and displacing it with some pollution. That wasn't very notable or it wasn't worth pricing in some sense. We call it an externality, but the externality for these particular items used to be very low or really zero for practical purposes. Now the situation has changed, and the marginal value is a lot higher. We just don't know how high it is. And one of the things we need to really focus on is measuring the cost of this pollution and incentivizing companies and people and others to, respond to the price and sort of bear the price in some manner. And that's ongoing right now. The point I wanted to make is that we are sort of, it's true we are polluting a lot, but it's also because we are so emphasizing the market side. That is, we are trying to make the market more and more efficient, so to speak. But the more we focus on the market and, the financial markets that are really highly developed, the less, the more we will, in the end, actually pollute, unless we get measures for the other side. And my point is really this, that it is the single-minded pursuit of markets that really has caused a lot of cost on the side of those unmeasured activities. So we know this from incentive theory, that if we have various kinds of activities, it's always a problem where one activity can be measured very precisely and the other activity, such as, in this case it's polluting, you can measure it very poorly. So there's a strong imbalance, and we tend to focus on what gets measured. We don't focus on what's not get measured. So that's a little different way of thinking about why it is so important to get measured. And it also brings up the fact that there are ways other than just measuring or how to deal with this easy to measure, high-powered sort of measurement of the market economy. I don't want to go into it because it's slightly complicated, but for economists in the audience, that's worthwhile noting, that there's this imbalance between measurement that is ultimately really driving this problem. And so the question is, what can we do about it? I will point out that there's another, I wouldn't call it a problem, but there's another thing that is also poorly measured these days, and that is the value of digital goods. So we don't see, we all have our phones, we all have our gadgets, and I mean, billions of people have mobile phones. Mobile phones in Africa is worth more than having running water. And so the value of these phones and this technology is enormous. But it really doesn't at all show up in the market the way we would like to. Basically because the marginal cost is close to zero. And so what we want to do, when we measure gross national product, it's all based on marginal costs. But if the marginal cost is zero, it just doesn't, it's like these goods are not in the market in the first place at all. They are free or almost free from this point of view, and therefore they don't show up in the gross national product. And so this has had the economist attention for a while. And the attention comes from mainly from Silicon Valley and some of my colleagues from MIT and elsewhere now also, and how to correct for this problem. And the main way they are correcting from this problem is that they do large-scale surveys using these very goods, digital goods. So we have an enormous opportunity to actually, we have a lot of data, we have a good way of actually analyzing the data. So just to take an example, they do surveys where 3 million people answer the question, how much do you value good X over good Y, or how costly do you think pollution is for you, or various kind of survey questions. That surveys were met with a lot of skepticism for many years, but now it's getting to be pretty serious business, because it has been noted that this knowledge that is in the minds of these millions and millions and billions of people can actually be accessed. And you can get questions about what do people think. So during the crisis, for instance, or the COVID crisis, they asked in several places, but one, for instance, in Boston, they asked people, how much do you value the park? And the way they asked it, that if you were be unable to go to the park, there was a Central Park in Boston, if you were unable to go to the park, for a week, how much would you be willing to pay to avoid this fate? And it's it wasn't very much per person, but it was actually about $100. People were willing to pay $100 to go to the park rather than not go to the park. And when you add up that, the number of people in Boston, it was a significant amount of money that the value of having that park was there. But for everybody, it was free in normal times. But they felt it now. And now when they ask, by the way, it's now $20 because they don't feel they are not stressed by the virus anymore and they can go for free. But it's just a trivial little example, but they have asked, they basically are looking to get what we call demand curves for various kind of goods. When we look at the market, we see just 1 point of the demand curve, the valuation curve of goods. And so they have methods that you can use to actually get the full demand curve and then get what we call the consumer surplus rather than just the marginal cost. And it's the consumer surplus has always been important, but it hasn't been a significant distortion until goods start to get to zero. And the flip side, of course, of that is that the marginal cost of climate and biodiversity and all other sort of big items that we are talking about now, it used to be close to zero, so we didn't pay attention to it. Water was free and everything was just free. And now the marginal cost is really starting to rise, but we don't have a good way of measuring it, though we have markets. So the paradox in some sense relative to what I said in the beginning is that one way to correct for this imbalance is to create market measures for, the goods that we call, the climate and other public goods that we are now concerned about. So that's one thing. Let me make a comment. So the measurement is very big. That's what the message is. And the more it's not going to be corrected by just making the economy more efficient. In fact, it's rather the reverse, that we are at the point where we are pushing for the efficiency of the market without pushing equally for the efficiency of measuring the non-market goods. The other point I want to make is we hear all about the commons problem. We all live on the same planet, and so it's everybody's problem that we are polluting and so on. And we also hear about 1.5. We are not going to meet the 1.5. It's going to be 1.7. I want to comment on these two things. The first, let's take the latter. How many of you feel like it's really scary that we are going from 1.5 to 1.7 degrees? I don't think any of us, even, I bet you wouldn't, would have no idea that that's a significant concern. Finland, the country where I'm from, is 9 degrees colder on average than southern France. So we feel like, 1.7, maybe that's too little. Maybe like 2 degrees warmer would be nice. So, of course, that's not true. But it's just that this number, 1.5, I think, has been a terrible public disaster in terms of engaging people. It doesn't move anybody to hear. If when they hear 1.5, it may be 1.8. I mean, who cares? You got to have a different message. And the message we have, of course, received is, storms, hurricanes, destruction, floods. Now we are talking. And the link between 1.5 and these hurricanes is not something that our mind could have worked out. So I would recommend just stop talking about the 1.5. I think it's the wrong objective to communicate with. And the second thing is that, by the way, is also an incentive point of view. You have picked the wrong measure that is going to move people. The other thing I want to say is I believe we shouldn't think about global. We can do a lot locally. And people will be engaged by local things. They don't get engaged by hearing that the planet is going to hell. They are engaged by the fact that by our floods, we are ready to do things that we see nearby. And so there has been a lot of work. Elinor Ostrom, for instance, who is a a late Nobel Prize winner, emphasized that, when you deal with these externalities or this common good problem, local solutions are often better and come naturally to people rather than having, even having the government involved. In fact, having just the local community fisheries can be handled, overfishing can be handled by those who fish to come into agreement in some ways. So these externalities, there's a lot of things you can do to kind of engage people on a what I call, a local scale, and so I would go in that direction. I would not worry about all the time whether or not, all countries are signing this agreement or not. I think do something right now here where people feel they are making a difference for their local community. And so you see it in a paradoxical way in places where there is pollution, air pollution. So that, like take China, you can't breathe anymore. I tell you, people come up with new ideas when you can't breathe. It's a good incentive scheme. And actually China is very far on, surprisingly fast cleaning their air in some of the cities. So I believe that these kind of local engagements will be the path to perhaps eventually understand better the global side. But I just believe I would start right away, right today, with local things we can and engage people in that manner. Is that, am I over time? Let me then detract a few of my comments.
Bengt has explained that GDP is not the right way to measure welfare. But then the question is, how can we measure welfare? What's the goal of our society? How can we aggregate individual preference to determine what should be done in our society? Do we live in a good society? What are the kind of good action we should perform to improve the way we live together? I think this definition, how we define the common good remains one of the most unconsensual issues in society, and we see every day social stress in our communities, in our nation about this issue. The absence of consensus about what is common good raises a lot of issues. So, for example, when we think about retirement age, which has been an issue in France over the last few months, is it good to extend the retirement age? I think many people disagree on the assumption that increasing the working time in your lifetime is compatible with common good. On one side, you have the benefits of leisure to when you retire early, against the benefit for society to collect creation of value from labor. This value creation is transformed into incomes for the worker, but also it generates social security benefit for the community to spend for retirement of other people, unemployment benefits. It's also generate income tax for society that could be used to improve, our defense, could improve, allow for investing in the energy transition. Is it the good action to extend the retirement age or not? That's an issue on which we fully disagree. On the entire spectrum, political spectrum, and clearly there is a debate there. And one of the issues is that we don't know how to compare the cost and the benefits of that kind of economic reform. Other example, you have many of them. Vaccine. What's the value of vaccine? Bengt mentioned the idea that we're mostly producing vaccine as a zero marginal cost. But think about the counterfactual. What would have happened to our society over the last 3 years if we would not have a vaccine? vaccine. Okay, clearly we would have to stay longer in lockdowns with all the social and psychological costs associated to that, all the economic costs associated to not working or working in a degraded environment. So the value of vaccine is certainly much larger than the price and the cost of the vaccine. How do we measure this value? Bengt, I think, is clearly explained that the fact that it's a complex issue imply that the way we value those things in classical measure like GDP is not performed well. Bengt mentioned water. I would also mention pesticides. Using water pumped from non-renewable water resources, or using pesticide in our field has obviously benefits in terms of GDP. You create production that you can sell on the market. At the same time, you deteriorate the environment for yourself and the environment for future generations. This is not taken into account in GDP, although it has an important impact on our welfare. So steel production is another example. I like that one because steel production represents 8% of global CO2 emission on our planet. So it's something important. The problem is switching from the current black furnace technology to hydrogen and green electricity or blue electricity is very costly. And under some measure, you double the cost of producing steel by switching to this kind of decarbonated solution. So that will imply that people will incur additional cost when they use new car or when they build new apartment. That will create some kind of carbon-induced inflation with negative impact on purchasing power. At the same time, that has benefits. How do we compare to this cost and benefits? Tomorrow, or I don't remember the program, at least in this summit, you will also talk about, animal welfare. How do we take into account in our collective goal the fact that our society imposes pain and suffering to animals? How do we integrate animal welfare in our collective goal? So again, my problem is how can we define a good action? Okay, a good action in the domain of health, in the domain of labor and leisure, in the domain of the environment. All the fact that we still have difficulty to discuss those issues imply that we are living in a society where it's hard to debate and therefore to contribute to producing the right decision. We believe as economists that we should use a cost-benefit analysis approach. We should compare societal cost and societal benefits to determine whether a specific action is socially desirable or not. When I say that, I don't think that could be non-consensual. I mean, the issue is what cost and what benefit do we take into account, and more specifically, what are the values? How do we value those impacts? Right? In pesticide, how do we compare the benefits of using pesticide to increase agricultural productivity and the environmental and ecological cost associated to using that? Okay, so valuing things is important and it's extremely complex in some dimension. Economists have some comparative advantage to try to measure how people themselves value the impact on which they suffer. Let me take an example. What's the value of life? What are you ready to pay? Bengt was mentioning valuation of park, leisure. The harder question is how do we value for ourselves the possibility to live one more year or to reduce the probability of dying tomorrow? Okay, and that's a very important issue when we think again about pandemics, for example. Was it wise to go lockdown society in March 2020, or should we, to save life, but that cost hundreds of billions of euros of GDP at the same time. What was the optimal intensity of the lockdown, the duration of the lockdown? It's very difficult to debate about that as long as we are not able to collectively value and compare the monetary benefits or the economic benefits of an action and the non-economic or non-financial or non-monetary impact on society. So valuing things are one of the things I think we should invest more effort in the political debate in order to try to get to a better decision. Okay, I believe it's very hard to get to the right collective decision if we are not first able to value the different impact that will be generated by the policy. So let me go from the issues of how do we define a good action? You understand, I think we should measure cost and benefits and define a good action as something that generates more social benefit than social cost. Do we live in a society? Do we live today in a society in France or around the world? Do we live in a good society? I mean, do we live in a society where the good actions are performed? Okay, different answers there. Okay, first, if we compare our way of working together with this liberal democracy, with free market economy, clearly we perform better than alternatives. I will not go back to the utopias of the 20th century, compare the East German to the West German performance, both in terms of the economy, purchasing power, and in terms of environment. Compare a Trabant with Renault in the 80s. So by comparison, I think history tells us free market economy has performed better. But that does not mean that the free market works well. Okay, of course, and most economists in this room, in particular most of my colleagues, if not all my colleagues in TSE, recognize that the free market economy does not work well because of the externalities, because of asymmetric information and moral hazard problem, because as Vincent mentioned at the beginning, because our private interests are not aligned with the common good, defined in the way I just explained a minute ago. So this means that today in our liberal democracy, there are rooms for opportunities that generate more benefits to the sacrifice that are associated to those opportunities. One example of that is climate change. Clearly, reducing emissions of CO2 compared to the status quo in a free market where there is no incentive to decarbonate, reducing emission generates more benefits than cost. Okay, and in particular, a lot of specific action, like using public transportation rather than your car, that generates more benefit than cost. And the way to align the private interest, the myriad of private interest with the common good, is to use a carbon price. Last point: in this world, who should act? That's also a difficult question. Okay, we these days, and look at the activists outside, or maybe in this room, there is a lot which rely on the shoulder of the corporation. Okay, activists do not like too much to ask effort to the consumers, to the citizens. Many people believe we should ask the corporation to make the effort. What's the role of corporation? Okay, compared to consumer, a carbon price will generate effort, will induce people to perform effort where the cost of the effort is smaller than the price of carbon, and those efforts will be performed at the same time by corporation that will be induced to do those efforts, and by consumer who also will be induced to go to sobriety, reduce temperature in their apartment and things like that. It's very complex for a corporation to do, and that's where greenwashing problem materialize. It's very difficult for a corporation to be environmentally responsible where the competitors around the world are not incentivized to behave responsibly. Let me go back to the steel problem. Okay, if you become responsible as a steel producer by decarbonating your technology, you double your cost, and you cannot survive in a competitive market if nobody else do the same. So it's good being responsible, but dead is not very useful for society. Okay, so we need to think better about those issues and being clearer about who should do what and who is responsible for what. In this case, I believe that carbon pricing is a transformation of the rules of the market economy that induce the right behavior, and all the steel producers will face exactly the same incentive to perform responsibly. Finally, how do we define common good? I believe you understood that GDP is not the right way to measure that. An increase in GDP does not mean an increase in welfare. There may be cases where the GDP will be increased, but welfare will be down. Okay, because of all those externalities and all those deterioration of the environment that will not be taken into account in this measure of welfare, the GDP. I try to explain that we should go to include in GDP issues like carbon price, like the value of the emissions of CO2 that our society generate and that will generate costs for future generation. But we also do the same thing for other dimensions, like deterioration of biodiversity. That's a difficult issue because, we don't know really how to measure biodiversity, not mentioning the way we should value biodiversity. That's remains a very difficult question. So there is still a long way to go to try to find a mechanism and a method to measure welfare. And it's a problem because as long as we don't agree on the measure of welfare, it's difficult to get to a consensus about what should be done in our society. Thank you very much.
Merci. Donc, il nous reste une douzaine de minutes pour prendre quelques questions. Je vais...
Thank you. We have about a dozen minutes, so I'm going to ask the moderators to get the first slide as it was asked, the first question as it was asked in English, and it will be directed to Bengt. And I'm going to hand over.
And services considering impact on nature and people.
Yeah, so I was trying to suggest that these surveys is one route to go. There is, of course, also markets creating like pollution markets, as has been the case, or the right to pollution rights in Europe. There's a market and there's a market price, and so we see what the companies value or what the value of these scarce resources to pollute really come up with. So that's one avenue. But as I said, I think with the digital economy, one of the main mechanisms is going to go is to get survey results that from people to assess the value that these various goods are doing. The question then comes. Well, there was another question here about who's going to pay for the cost and I understand that poor people, feel like should we now start paying for the fact that we are breathing air and drinking water? Well, the fact is that water is already expensive. It's more expensive than milk, which it was zero when I was born. So that's an example of something that has changed. But you can always try to subsidize in various ways to compensate the people who suffer the most, which are usually, unfortunately, the poor people. So I don't think it's an unsurmountable task to give them either the rights or give them the compensation for what they pay for these previously free goods.
Maybe I could complement this. So one of the issues about impact on nature, that nature, I mean, those impacts are typically irreversible, and so they will be there forever. They will be borne, this deterioration of nature and the environmental will be borne by future generations. And then the issue is how do we take into account of our current decision, climate policies, for example. The fact that most of the consequence of our irresponsible behavior will be not borne by, this consequence will not be borne by the current generation, but for people who will live in the distant future. So there is an issue about how do we define sustainability? What's the sense of what's sustainability, and what our society should be ready to pay, to sacrifice, to go back to the title of the day, what should we be ready to sacrifice today in order to improve the welfare of future generations? And of course, this question heavily depends upon what's our belief about the future of our civilization on this planet. Okay, of course, if we believe that there will be a future generation going back to Stone Age, for example, and there are stories about that when you go to the movies, and science fiction movies in particular. If we believe that there is a risk, even with a low probability, but there is a risk that our future generation will go back to Stone Age, then of course our responsibility is very strong, and we should really do something about that. Okay, in economics, we tended over the last century to believe in growth, there will be a 2% growth rate every year, forever, and therefore the consequence of that is we should not do too much for the future, because investing for the future is increasing the sacrifice for the current generation, which is poor compared to the future generation. And therefore, economists tend in the past to use a rather large discount rate, that is to penalize a lot those investments that generate benefits only for the distant future. And these days, and in particular, myself and colleagues around the world, we are working on recognizing the deep uncertainty we face about the destiny of our civilization, and that has deep consequence about the way we measure and we put values on things like carbon. Okay, and that has consequence on the way we should think of how much effort our generation should perform in order to face its responsibility toward future generations.
Alors Christian, à ce moment-là vient la question suivante qui est tout à fait liée à cette proclamation.
So the next question that is very related to that,
To unmeasurable goods, don't we increase the risk to differentiate people by money, like paying to get water? And moreover, who should manage? Who should decide? Government, companies?
Yeah, I mean, the point, currently water is free, okay? Mostly free for most people using water. And the consequence is we have waste, okay? And we have fights, social fights, about how to allocate these scarce resources. So the current situation is not good. So one solution proposed by economists is to price water and to make sure that people internalize in our decision to use water, okay, in particular in periods of drought, when we don't have much water, we would like to force people to internalize the opportunity cost of water. Okay, right. That in pricing this scarce resource is, I believe, a necessity if we want to reduce the social pressure on this resource and to induce a more efficient allocation of water. At the same time, we should recognize that pricing water will be will affect negatively the most vulnerable people and probably the poorest people in our society. And that should be taken into account. But that could be done. If you price something, you generate a revenue, and you can use this revenue to compensate the poorest, okay, without affecting the strength of the price signals of the system. And you can do that also for climate change. Pricing carbon, okay, the revenue generated by pricing carbon can be used to compensate the poorest. In particular, that would imply that you could at the same time fight climate change and fight inequalities. You can do the two things together. The problem is there is a political tension there, and most often politicians do not use the carbon revenue to compensate the poor.
Bengt, une question dans la foulée de celle-ci.
One question in the wake of this one: if indeed the carbon tax, the carbon price is used to redistribute the income, the revenue, there are other methods as well, symbolic methods. A report was handed over to the French Prime Minister last week, stating what you and Christian are saying, that energy transition is spontaneously unequalitarian. This report by Jean Pisani-Ferry, which is talked about in the magazine that you have in your hands, Challenge, suggests that there be a tax on the richest, a symbolic tax, not so symbolic because it's going to be 150 billion euros to withdraw. And he proposes having that to show that there is a gesture on the part of the most wealthy, whereas on the other hand, asking for people to move to resources such as electric cars is expensive. You as non-French, and do you think that this symbolic tax could be something that could lead to better understanding of the sacrifices of climate change?
That's a difficult question for me to answer because it's partly political, and you are talking about how do people emotionally react to having the rich bear a bigger part of the burden, and I don't know the answer. I would say that in general, I believe people react to what they have to pay, and so I would go down the route that Christian just said. You can just, as an experiment, you can, in this day of technology, you can give people the right to, for instance, for free, get some quota of water or whatever the scarce resource is that's valuable. But you give to everybody for free some quota, and then these poorer people can, in principle, just sell they can sell it in order to generate. This is what, some of the tickets, when you have performances, the ticket prices usually are too low, so they will be overpriced, and then there will be people who can't afford buying them because they were lucky to get a ticket, but they can also then sell it forward and generate revenue for them. These are just alternative ways of doing what Christian was saying. You have a way of redistributing some of the profits or the money that's generated by this tax to the poor people. So I would say, especially in these days with digitalization and we all having these phones and ways of paying, I think there's huge opportunities to do this in an efficient and really large scale, even if you wish, really on a world scale. Let me bring one thing that I think is really difficult, and that is that when you start taxing these things, companies, take Finland, they have started to sell their polluting paper machines and other machines to Africa and to developing countries. And actually there they pollute even more than they pollute when they are used in Finland. But that's recognized as in Finland, these being responsible citizens when they sell their, when they go to less polluting machines. But there should be a way of accounting for the fact that if you sell something that's polluting, you need to sort of be paying for it also as you sell it. and it's kind of a double entry bookkeeping system of the energy costs. But I think that's in the future somewhere.
Christian, un mot sur cette question et un mot de conclusion, effectivement.
Réduire les inégalités par une
Reducing inequalities by increasing the taxes paid by the rich people, I think it's a good instrument, but it's not an instrument that will incentivize the rich to reduce their carbon emissions. Why not a carbon tax that is particularly high for products that are especially consumed by the rich people, such as private jets, for instance? Why not have a specific carbon tax that is 10 times, 100 times higher than the tax that is paid by the average consumer in France? That would incentivize the rich people to really decarbonate, and if they refuse to change their way of life, one way of financing investments toward green things that we need for the future, we would win on all sides. So we noted that proposal. So now let me ask you to thank the speakers, and I will invite Ghislaine Ottenheimer to the next session, how to comply with the Paris agreements. Thank you both.